Sing praise, sing praise. Forever God is faithful, forever God is strong, forever God is with us, forever and ever, forever.
Jesus infuriated the religious leaders of his day because of the company he kept. He intentionally defied conventions by hanging around social misfits, and he encouraged his followers to do the same. Brad McKinnon is the Dean of Students at HCU. Here he looks at the parable of the Great Dinner in Luke 14, verses 16 to 24, and shows us again that inclusion is a necessary part of the Christian life.
Food and hospitality are prominent themes in Luke's gospel. Obviously, you have Jesus' temptation in the wilderness where he's challenged, "If you're the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." And his response, "One does not live by bread alone." Jesus also faced criticism regarding his social habits. He came eating and drinking and was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. In Luke 7, he was invited to the home of Simon, a Pharisee. As he took his place at the table, a woman began to weep and anoint his feet with ointment. This gives Jesus the opportunity to talk about hospitality and forgiveness. He explained to the host, "A certain creditor had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts of both of them." Then Jesus asks, "Now which one of them will love him more?" "The one who was forgiven the greater debt," is the reply. Jesus reminds Simon, "When I came into your home, you didn't show me hospitality. You gave me no water for my feet, but this woman, she has bathed my feet with her tears." Later on, Jesus feeds thousands from just a few loaves and 2 fish. Jesus enjoyed socializing with friends as well, especially the siblings Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. On one occasion, he's welcomed into Martha's home and she's busy preparing the meal while Mary's listening to Jesus. And Jesus helps Martha to understand, don't be too distracted about the mundane things of life. Sometimes it's good just to sit at Jesus' feet and listen. Even many of Jesus' parables centered on food and hospitality. There's the parable of the friend at midnight, where the man needs 3 loaves of bread to serve an unexpected visitor. Who can forget the feast welcoming the prodigal son home, who was dead and now is alive again? And then, of course, you have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man who feasted sumptuously every day, while Lazarus merely wanted to satisfy his hunger with crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. After his resurrection even, Jesus sat at table with his disciples. On one occasion, he took bread and he blessed and broke it. And on another occasion, he enjoyed a broiled fish meal with his disciples. When it comes to food and hospitality, I'm sure most of us were taught good table manners growing up. You know the drill. Chew with your mouth closed, use your napkin, elbows off the table. But other than these basics, what makes a good dinner guest? Some might focus on arriving on time. Others might emphasize being an interesting conversationalist. Showing appreciation for the food might be most important to you. It depends on your upbringing, depends on your culture. In many ways, Jesus would have been the ideal dinner guest. His genuineness, his compassion, his concern, his gentle correction would have made him a welcome guest in just about any home. In fact, the crowds really loved being around Jesus. In Luke 13:17, we're told that the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. I wonder sometimes if those who liked being around Jesus, spending time with him, would like being around us, spending time with us. However, at other times, Jesus could have been quite provocative and controversial. And that's the case in Luke 14 and the parable of the dinner. Jesus' parables in Luke are really interesting because most of them don't seem really pre-planned. Jesus is acting more like a storyteller than a preacher or a teacher. He travels from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south, and he's visiting village after village, house to house, telling these stories. He teaches these parables in response to questions. For instance, the question, "Who is my neighbor?" leads to the parable of the Good Samaritan. He tells these stories based on requests or demands. "Make my brother divide the inheritance with me," provides motivation for Jesus' parable of the rich fool. Sometimes Jesus has to respond to accusations. The snide remark, "This man receives sinners and eats with them," contributes to a series of parables about sheep and coins and sons. And then, of course, in our text, the parable of the dinner. It's sparked by a personal observation that Jesus makes. So let's set the scene. Jesus is invited for Sabbath dinner at the house of a leader of the Pharisees. These folks are returning from worshiping together, but everyone is watching Jesus suspiciously. How often do we use opportunities that should be centered on God to be rather centered around ourselves and our own personal bickering and disputes? There's a man that is suffering from dropsy or edema. Edema is a swelling of the organs and skin because of fluid buildup in the body's tissues. It causes you to gain a lot of weight. It's very painful. You even have trouble just moving. And Jesus heals this man. He heals him on the Sabbath, even while everyone is suspiciously watching what he'll do. And he teaches us something. He teaches us that it's never wrong to do the right thing. But Jesus is apparently a people watcher too. He notices in the text that the guests, they're choosing places of honor. They're scrambling for the most prominent seats. And he warns them. He warns them that if you exalt yourself, you're going to be humbled. But if you humble yourself, you'll be exalted. And then he turns his attention to the host. And he says in verse 12 beginning, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, or you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you." Wow. Here Jesus is accepting an invitation to dinner, and then he proceeds to criticize the man's guest list. Obviously, Jesus wasn't above breaking social conventions now and again to make a point. But notice that Jesus sees hospitality as sort of a spiritual experience that brings a blessing. He says you should be hospitable, not because you're going to be repaid, but at the end of verse 14 he says to experience a blessing in the resurrection. But notice here the four categories of those that Jesus suggests you're not to invite, and the four categories of those he says you are to invite. First, who shouldn't you invite? It's interesting that the folks that we're not supposed to invite are the ones that we're most likely to interact with socially. Our friends, our family, and our neighbors. Why would we not want to invite them? How could we possibly avoid inviting them? Well, maybe because it's expected. You remember, Jesus is telling us that this is a spiritual experience, and we shouldn't do spiritual things simply because they're expected. Maybe because we feel some sort of family responsibility. But remember, Jesus emphasized that his brothers and sisters were those who did his will. And obviously, as Jesus mentions, there's the temptation to have an ulterior motive, that maybe some way you could be paid back. Then we have those that you're supposed to invite. It wasn't unusual in the ancient world for many to think about the poor or disabled, that they're in some way being singled out as particularly cursed by God. Maybe they had committed some grievous sin that brought about their predicament. These folks obviously can't return the favor of a luncheon or a dinner party. And sometimes these folks were held in such low regard that they were considered religiously inferior. They weren't even included in the spiritual aspects of life, not even welcome in the temple often. And we might say today, surely everyone should be welcome in a house of worship. But think about our own segregated worship patterns that exist even in the United States today. Maybe based on class or social status or race. Are we really much different? Don't we often try to think about those that we feel are socially, educationally, or religiously inferior as worthy of exclusion? But Jesus says there's just something special, spiritual even, about doing something good for someone who can't do anything for you in return. And I wonder, what would it be like if those who we might not even interact with on a regular basis, those who couldn't possibly pay us back, those who are the excluded, those who are the marginalized, what would it be like if they were the first ones that we invited to a dinner party? What would it be like if they were the first ones that we sought to serve? It must have been uncomfortable for everyone present to hear Jesus criticizing the host for his guest list. There must have been an awkward moment of silence. And we probably all know someone who just can't stand those moments of awkward silence. Maybe you're even that person. And one of those sitting with Jesus must have been like this. Because after Jesus says, these are the people you're not to invite, these are the people you are to invite, there's a man that awkwardly shouts, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." And then you can almost hear Jesus say, "Indeed, let me tell you what the kingdom of God is really like." And then he turns to his fellow guest and he tells a story in verses 16 through 24. Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is ready now." But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, "I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets." Another said, "I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. Please accept my regrets." Another said, "I've just been married and therefore I cannot come." So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, "Go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." And the slave said, "Sir, what you ordered has been done, and there is still room." Then the master said to the slave, "Go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner." There are 3 groups of invitees in the parable. First, let's look at the excuse makers. Someone might think it's strange to buy a field before seeing it, or buying apparently 10 oxen before trying them out. But we need to understand that when somebody was to hear Jesus talk about these sort of excuses, buying a field, buying oxen, and just getting married, they would have immediately recognized Deuteronomy 20, verses 5 through 7 in the story. This passage mirrors the excuses found in Jesus' parable. And in Deuteronomy 20, verses 5 through 7, what we have are acceptable excuses. Remember that, acceptable excuses for being absent from military service in Israel. The text reads, "Then the officials shall address the troops, saying, Has anyone built a new house but not dedicated it? You should go back to his house. Or he might die in the battle and another dedicate it. Has anyone planted a vineyard but not yet enjoyed its fruit? He should go back to his house, or he might die in battle and another be first to enjoy its fruit. Has anyone become engaged to a woman but not yet married her? He shall go back to his house, or he might die in the battle and another marry her." And so, if you've built a house, go home and dedicate it. If you've planted a vineyard, go home and enjoy its fruit. If you're engaged to be married, go home and marry your fiancée. But notice in our parable that the master of the house responds differently. He responds in anger, the text says. And so, as one scholar has put it, even acceptable excuses for not helping to defend your community and your country don't work in the kingdom of God. The second group are those in the streets and in the lanes. And it's interesting that these match the four categories that Jesus mentioned earlier: the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame. And these are, again, people that are singled out as cursed, maybe worthless even, those who are excluded. And then you have the third group. And this group is made up of those who are living on the outskirts of town, you might say, out at the highways and in the hedges. And so these are the outsiders. These are the marginalized. These are the folks who are not welcome among the political or social and religious elites. So what does the kingdom of God look like? Apparently there were those in Jesus' day who should have been ready for what God was doing, but they weren't willing to accept the invitation when it deviated from their own expectations. Again, Jesus had been accused of spending too much time with tax collectors and sinners. But I wonder how those of us who have been so privileged socially and educationally and religiously today would receive Jesus' ministry. Maybe much in the same way. But how happy are those who have been excluded for so long to finally be given a place? That was true in Jesus' day, and we certainly know that's true in our day. So what does authentic Christianity look like? Jesus tells us that it's a place or a sense of inclusion, living life in community where everyone has a place. There was a popular 80s sitcom whose tagline was, "Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name." We all have this deep human need to feel welcome and included. But we also have a tendency to practice exclusion. So how do we practice inclusiveness? It may literally include creating worship spaces and services that are accessible to the physically disabled. After all, Jesus did say, invite those who were the crippled, the maimed, the blind. It may include also being intentional and taking active steps to be a guest-friendly church. It may include that while recognizing the significance historically of social constructs like race and class, that ultimately we must see everyone as made in the image of God. It may include recognizing the two greatest commands, loving God with all that you have and loving your neighbor as yourself. It may include asking ourselves, what would it really look like to take the teachings of Jesus seriously in our lives as individuals, in our homes, and in our churches? For instance, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." Do we really understand the significance of that statement? Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. In the hours just before his death, in Luke 22, Jesus acted as host instead of guest, and one of the themes seemed to be inclusion. The personal pronouns, you'll notice, are significant. He says, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you. Take this and divide it among yourselves. This is my body, which is given for you. This cup is poured out for you. Even the one who betrayed him was with him. And Jesus would say those same words to us today, that Jesus eagerly desires to eat at table with us, that he desires us to share in table fellowship, in community with each other, that he has given us his body and his blood for all of us, even those that let him down from time to time. And so we as Christians, as we gather at table each Sunday to better understand life in community, we must proclaim solidarity, not only with Christ, but with each other. Often we focus so much on the symbolism of the meal that we overlook somehow the actual, real presence of Christ at the table as host. Do we understand Jesus as host, or do we sometimes try to control the table on our own terms? Understanding inclusion doesn't mean denying any expectations. After all, those who were invited in the story had to respond favorably. And if they didn't, the master was angry. We even notice in the parable the word compel. But ultimately, inclusion means just that, inclusion. It means inclusion for the insider, for the socially, educationally, and religiously privileged, who are prepared to favorably receive the invitation to the banquet. But it also includes the outsider, who might not look the part or understand our religious jargon, but in the words of Jesus' story, yet still there is room. And we must ask ourselves, are we inviting in our demeanor and in our actions so that God's house may be filled? As in the words of the famous hymn by Charles Gabriel, all things are ready. Come to the feast. Come, for the table now is spread. You famishing, you weary, come, and you shall be richly fed. Come feast upon the love of God and drink everlasting life.
Sing praise.